whispers crawl beneath the skin, a shadow's grin.
The Tourney of the Damned. In Chapter 1. The Hook. The road to Louviers was a river of mud and memory. Sir Godfrey, the Lion of Aquitaine, rode it like a statue of flesh and steel. His armor, polished to a mirror's gleam, threw back the gray afternoon light. His cloak, heavy with embroidered lions, hung still in the damp air. Behind him, his retinue clattered and laughed, but Godfrey heard only the old silence in his own head, the silence that came before a charge, the silence of a tomb. 20 years, the trees had grown, some cottages had new thatch, but the bones of the land were the same. The low, green hills hunched like sleeping dragons. The smell of wet earth and wood smoke was exactly as he remembered. It was here, on this very field now coming into view, that he had ceased to be Godfrey of Louviers and had become something else. A name, a story, the undefeated. The town walls were a frenzy of color. His colors, banners of crimson and gold, flapped from every tower and turret. As his party approached the gates, a cheer went up, a rolling wave of sound that broke against his helmet. Faces, red and smiling, lined the road. Petals, late spring roses and early daisies, were strewn before his horse's hooves. They looked like flecks of blood and bone. The Lord Mayor, a man whose face Godfrey did not know, gave a speech of welcome. The words were fat with flattery, thin with truth. Godfrey nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. They were a blur of joy. He sought a different face, though he did not admit it to himself. A young face, pale and serious, with eyes wide not with adoration, but with the focused fear of a boy about to do his duty. He did not see it. Of course he did not. That evening, in the great hall of the Lord's manor, there was a feast. The air was thick with the smells of roast boar and spilled ale. Minstrels sang songs he had heard in 100 halls, each one adding another impossible feat to his legend. He sat at the high table, a goblet of wine untouched before him, a hollow man in a shell of metal. His squire, a bright-eyed boy named Theo, lined in. "Is it not glorious, my lord, to return in such triumph?" Godfrey looked at him. "Triumph is a house with many rooms, boy. Most of them are empty." Theo blinked, confused. Godfrey turned his gaze back to the hall. The next morning, the tourney began with a procession. The competing knights, 50 of them, rode in a glittering line around the lists. The sun had broken through, setting everything ablaze. Pennants snapped. Horses snorted steam. The crowd roared for each knight, but the loudest roar was saved for last. Sir Godfrey entered the field. The sound was physical, a pressure against his chest plate. He rode slowly, his great warhorse, Templar, packing with imperial dignity. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, and the roar doubled. He scanned the faces in the front row, the nobles, the ladies, the merchants, a sea of smiles. Then he saw him. At the far end of the competitors' line, slightly apart from the others, was a knight. His armor was not glittering. It was old, a style from 2 decades past, pitted and dull, the color of forgotten iron. His surcoat was faded almost to gray, but the crest was just visible, a white swan on a field of blue. A cold finger traced Godfrey's spine. The house of Eloiso, a minor family from the northern marshes, extinct now, he had heard. The knight sat utterly still. His helmet, a great bassinet with a long, pointed snout, was turned toward Godfrey. From within the dark slit of the visor, Godfrey felt eyes upon him, not cheering, not admiring, watching. The procession moved. Godfrey had to turn his head forward, but as he passed the end of the line, he looked back. The knight in the old armor had not moved, but his helmet dipped. a single, slow, deliberate nod. The noise of the crowd seemed to drain away, replaced by a ringing silence. Godfrey felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He knew that nod. He had seen it only once before, across a tilt-yard, moments before the lances were lowered. It was Sir Edwyn, the boy he had killed. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The first event was the archery contest. Godfrey did not participate. He sat in the shaded pavilion reserved for champions, watching as yeomen and knights, retainers, drew their bows. Theo stood beside him, chattering about form and fletching. Godfrey was not listening. His eyes were drawn to a lone figure at the far target, a man in a simple gray tunic, his face shadowed by a hood. He carried a longbow of yew, dark with age. He did not speak to the other archers. They, in turn, seemed to step around him as if avoiding a cold draft. The master of the games called the start. Arrows thudded into targets. Cheers rose for close shots. The man in gray knocked his first arrow, drew, and loosed. It was not a showy shot. It was efficient, final. It struck the very center of the target, the clout pin, with a sound like an axe hitting wood. A murmur went through the onlookers near that lane. The man knocked again, drew, loosed, another perfect shot, and another. He did not miss, not once. With each shaft, the air around his lane seemed to grow quieter. The cheers became uncertain, then died away altogether. When he won, he simply lowered his bow and walked away, not to collect his prize, but toward the competitors' tents. As he passed the pavilion, the hood turned slightly. Godfrey saw no face, only deeper shadow. But he saw the faint, ghostly outline of a white swan embroidered on the gray cloth. "Who was that?" Theo asked, his voice hushed. "I have never seen such shooting." "No," Godfrey said, his voice rough. "You have not." Next was the melee, a grand chaos of 20 knights in a roped-off section of the field, fighting with blunted swords until only one remained standing. Godfrey watched from horseback at the edge. The clash of steel, the grunts of effort, the thud of falls, it was a familiar music. Then he saw the armor, the old pitted plate. Sir Edwyn stood at the edge of the press, not rushing in. A knight in green and yellow charged him, sword high. Edwyn did not parry. He simply sidestepped, and as the knight passed, he tapped the flat of his own blade against the knight's backplate. The knight in green and yellow did not stumble. He froze. Then his sword dropped from his hand and he fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His face was white, his teeth chattering. His squires rushed to drag him from the field, calling for a physician. "Cold," the knight kept whispering. "So cold." It happened again and again. Edwyn moved through the fray like a wisp of fog. His touches were light, almost courteous, but each knight he struck fell not with injury, but with a profound, shaking chill. Soon he was the last one standing. The other knights lay scattered around him, groaning, their breath frosting in the warm spring air. Edwyn stood amidst them, his sword pointed down. He turned his helmet toward Godfrey. Another nod. The crowd was confused. They saw knights falling, but the blows seemed gentle. A murmur rippled through them. "Who is that? What house does he serve?" But the questions had no heat. Their eyes slid away from the victor as if he were a stain on the light. Only Godfrey's gaze remained fixed, cold and heavy as stone. That afternoon, Godfrey sent Theo to the town's small stone crypt beside the old chapel. "Find the Eloiso tomb," he commanded. "Read the epitaph to me." Theo returned an hour later, his young face pale. "My lord, it is a simple slab, very old. The name is Sir Edwyn of Eloiso, died 20 years ago this very week. The words below say," the boy swallowed. They say, unbested, unblessed, unresting. The words hung in the quiet of the pavilion. Unbested, he had died in his first joust. Unblessed, he had died without last rites, his neck snapped in the dust. Unresting. Godfrey dismissed the boy. He sat alone as the sun dipped, painting the tournament field in bloody gold. He understood now. This was no random haunting. This was a challenge left too long unanswered. The boy's soul was stuck in the moment of his defeat, his unfulfilled promise a hook in the fabric of life. He could not pass on until he was fairly bested. But how do you best a ghost? How do you defeat a memory? The answer came unwelcome and clear. You cannot, not in any way that matters to the living. This was a contest for souls, not for glory. The final joust was tomorrow. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that Sir Edwyn would be his only opponent. Chapter 3. The Descent. The night before the final joust was a long wound of darkness. Godfrey did not sleep. He sat in his tent, polishing his lance tip over and over, the rhythm failing to soothe him. The sounds of the celebratory feast outside were distant, meaningless. He heard only the remembered crack of a lance, the scream of a horse, the awful, silent crumple of a body in the dirt. He had been 18. Edwyn had been maybe 16, a squire knighted just for the tourney. Godfrey remembered the boy's eyes through the visor, determined, scared. They had charged. Godfrey's lance had struck true, but Edwyn's shield had been held at a slight angle. The force had twisted him, lifted him from the saddle, and he had fallen wrong. The sound was not loud. It was a dry stick snapping underfoot. They had called it a tragic accident, part of the risk of the lists. Godfrey had been praised for his strength, his skill. The victory had launched him. He had told himself the same story for 20 years, an accident, a twist of fate. The words on the tomb mocked that story, unbested. The boy had not been bested in skill, only in luck. His spirit had never accepted the loss. It had festered. As the first gray light of dawn touched the tent canvas, Godfrey made his decision. He could not win this joust, but he could not simply not compete. The ghost had drawn him here to this place for a reason. It demanded a conclusion, a true ending. The morning was misty, the sun a pale coin behind woolen clouds. The final day of the tourney was reserved for the joust, the pinnacle of chivalric sport. The lists were freshly raked, the barriers strong. The stands were packed, a mosaic of eager faces. Godfrey's name was announced to a thunderous ovation. He rode out onto the field, Templar bedecked in crimson and gold. He felt heavy, not the good, solid weight of armor, but the weight of years, of guilt, of a coming reckoning. The herald called for the challengers. One by one, knights rode forward, but each time as they reached the head of the list, they reined in. One clutched his stomach, suddenly ill. Another's horse shied violently at nothing. A third simply shook his head, turned, and rode back to the tents, his face bewildered. The crowd buzzed in confusion. Then, from the far end of the field, a single knight rode forward. The old pitted armor gleamed dully in the diffuse light. The faded blue surcoat with its white swan hung still in the windless air. The horse was a tall, gray destrier, its eyes dark and quiet. A silence fell, not the excited hush of anticipation, but a thick, muffling silence, as if the world had been packed in wool. The colors around the knight seemed to bleed away, leaving him a monochrome figure in a painted world. The crowd stirred, people whispered, squinted. Who is that? What house? But their interest was fleeting. Their eyes could not seem to hold him. They glanced, then looked away, forgetting him almost instantly. But Godfrey saw him with painful clarity, every dent in the armor, every fray of the surcoat. He saw the dark slit of the visor fixed on him. The herald, frowning at his scroll, found no name to match the crest. He looked to the Lord Mayor, who shrugged. "Let him ride," the mayor said, his voice uncertain. "The Lion of Aquitaine will dispatch him quickly." The rules were called, a contest of 3 passes. The knights took their positions at opposite ends of the list. Godfrey lowered his visor. The world became a slit of light and shadow. At the far end, the ghost knight sat motionless. No squire attended him. No lady's favor adorned his lance. He was a monument to absence. A trumpet sounded, thin and strained in the heavy air. Chapter 4. The Climax. Templar surged forward. Godfrey couched his lance, the familiar routine of muscle and balance taking over. The thunder of hooves filled his ears, but it sounded distant, muted. The crowd was a silent, waving forest. All he could hear was the rhythm of his own breath and the accelerating beat of his heart. The ghost knight charged. His horse made no sound. Its hooves kicked up no dirt. It was like watching a specter rush across a pane of glass. The distance closed. Godfrey focused on the target, the center of the ghost's shield. He adjusted his aim minutely. At the last second, he saw the ghost's own lance tip, steady as a star. He braced for impact. It did not come as it should. There was no shattering crash of wood, no jolt through his arm and shoulder. Instead, there was a sound like a deep, frozen tomb being opened. A hollow, resonant thud that vibrated in his bones, not his armor. The ghost's lance did not break. It passed through Godfrey's shield as if it were smoke. It passed through his polished breastplate. He felt a cold so intense it was a fire, a burning ice that speared through his chest and seized his heart. His breath left him in a white plume that did not fade but hung in the air. The world went gray and silent. He swayed in the saddle. Templar, sensing the wrongness, slowed and turned at the end of the list. Godfrey's fingers were numb on the reins. He looked down at his chest. The shield was unmarked. The armor was intact, but he felt a wound, deep and cold, in the very core of his being. He understood now completely. This was no contest of strength or skill. Those were the concerns of the living. This was a joust for a soul. Edwyn's lance struck not the body, but the spirit. Each pass was not an attempt to unhorse, but to unmake. The ghost knight turned his horse. He showed no sign of impact from Godfrey's own lance, which had struck true, but shattered harmlessly against the spectral shield, its splinters falling like ordinary wood. They took position again. The crowd was murmuring, restless. They had seen Godfrey's lance hit and break. They had seen him reel in his saddle, but they had seen no strike land upon him. They saw him tilting at empty air, and now he was acting like a man grievously wounded. Confusion was turning to concern, concern to disbelief. The trumpet sounded a second time. The second charge was worse. The cold was deeper, a spreading numbness that crawled from his chest down his limbs. His vision tunneled. The ghost knight seemed to grow larger, darker, the only sharp thing in a blurry world. The hollow thud of impact was softer this time, more final, like dirt falling on a coffin lid. Godfrey nearly fell. He clung to Templar's mane, his strength bleeding away into the chill. He knew he would not survive a third pass, not as he was. To be struck again by that lance would extinguish him completely. His soul would be forfeit, just as Edwyn's had been. They turned for the final pass. The crowd was almost silent now. A tense, bewildered hush lay over the field. Godfrey looked down the list at the waiting specter. He thought of 20 years of empty glory, of a boy in the dirt, of the words unbested, unblessed, unresting. He knew what he had to do. He could not best the ghost, but he could offer it a victory, a true, honorable victory, not the accident of 20 years past, but a conscious, chosen defeat. The trumpet sounded for the third and final time. Templar charged. Godfrey gathered the last of his physical strength, his will honed by 1,000 combats. He couched his lance. He aimed true, but as the distance closed, as the silent, gray night rushed toward him, a study in focused vengeance, Godfrey made his choice. At the very last moment, the moment when every instinct, every year of training screamed to lower the tip and brace for the hit, he did not. He lifted his lance. He turned its tip toward the sky. He offered his heart, unprotected, to the ghost. He saw the point of the other lance, a flicker of ethereal cold coming for his chest. He closed his eyes. The impact was not a thud this time. It was a sigh, a release. The cold flooded him, not as an invasion, but as an acceptance. It filled every vein, every corner of his spirit. It was the cold of the grave, yes, but also the cold of deep, still water, of peace. He felt himself falling. There was no pain, only a profound, spreading stillness. He hit the soft earth of the list with a soft crunch of metal, but he did not feel it. He lay on his back, looking up at the pale sky through the slit of his visor. Chapter 5. Resolution and Twist. A great collective gasp rose from the crowd, a wave of shock and horror. They had seen their champion charge, seen him inexplicably raise his lance, and then seen him flung from his horse as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. They saw him lie still in the dirt. For Godfrey, the world was quiet. The crowd's noise was a far-off sea. His breathing was shallow, each breath a small agony of cold. He felt weak, drained, as if the very essence of his strength had been poured out onto the field. Then a shadow fell across him. The ghost knight stood over him. He had dismounted. He stood silently, looking down. Then, slowly, he reached up with gauntleted hands and lifted his great bassinet helmet. Beneath it was not a skull, nor a rotted face. It was the face of Sir Edwyn, as Godfrey had seen it last, but transparent, like smoke held in the shape of a memory. He was young. His expression was not one of triumph or hatred. It was sad, profoundly, endlessly sad. And in that sadness, there was a glimmer of something else, understanding. The ghost knight looked at Godfrey, and he offered a faint, sad smile, a smile of acknowledgement, of release. Then he turned. He walked a few paces toward his gray horse, and as he walked, he began to fade. The solid iron of his armor became mist. The faint swan on his surcoat shimmered like a reflection on water. Then the mist itself dispersed, drawn upward on a breeze no one felt, vanishing into the gray sky. The ghost knight was gone. Godfrey was found to be alive, but barely. His body was unmarked, but he was ice-cold and weak as a newborn. They carried him to his tent, where physicians rubbed his limbs and piled furs upon him. The tourney of Louviers ended not with celebration, but with confused whispers. The Lion of Aquitaine had fallen to no one. It was a mystery, an ill omen. The story would be told in a dozen ways, none of them true. Godfrey survived, but the man who rose from that sickbed weeks later was not the Lion of Aquitaine. The legendary vigor was gone. His strength was that of an ordinary man, perhaps less. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, quiet chill. He could still ride, still wield a sword, but the invincibility was a memory. He returned the wretches, dismissed most of his retinue. He kept only Theo and a few loyal men. He did not return to the tournament circuit. Instead, he found a quiet estate not far from Louviers, and there he opened a school for squires. He became a teacher. He did not teach them the flashy tricks of the tilt, the ways to win glory. He taught them the weight of the lance. He taught them to look into their opponent's eyes before a charge. He taught them that chivalry was not about winning, but about the integrity of the contest, about honoring the man across from you, for he too had a soul that could be lost. The greatest victory, he would say, his voice soft but clear, is sometimes to lay down your lance. Years passed. Godfrey grew older, his hair white, his steps slow. He was a figure of gentle respect, a retired master, his strange final defeat now just a footnote in his long legend. But at every tourney he attended, as a guest of honor, he would feel it. A sudden cold spot in the cheering crowd, a pocket of silence in the roar, and if he turned his head just so, he would see him, for a moment only. A knight in old, pitted armor, standing at the edge of the field or in the shadows of an archway. The helmet would be on, but Godfrey would feel the gaze. And the ghost knight would nod. Not a challenge, not a threat, a reminder, a shared, silent understanding between them across the barrier of life and death, a bond forged in a final, honest joust where the loser had won his soul back and the winner had finally found his rest. Godfrey would nod back, then he would turn to the young squire beside him, his eyes seeing the past and the present all at once, and he would say, "Watch closely now. This next pass. See how he holds his shield. Remember that. It is everything." And the cold spot would fade, leaving only the memory and the enduring chill in his own heart, which was, he knew, the price of his peace.
Shadows in the